I'm Ben Weingarten,
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ellen Fantini.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And as a reminder before we kick off, from September 2 to 4, we have the NatCon 5 conference in Washington, D.C. We'll all be there. We'll look forward to seeing you there as well. Should be a compelling and hopefully inspiring set of sessions and conferences, and look forward to that opportunity. With that, as always, we will cover a diverse set of topics for this week. Inez is going to kick us off by talking about President Trump's crackdown on crime in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. I'll talk a little bit about the president's proposal around a perhaps mid-decade census and excluding non-citizens from the census. Will is going to talk a bit about the president's peace agenda and the various negotiations being worked out in a variety of conflicts around the world. And then last but not least, Ellen will talk a bit about the EU's plan to censor encrypted chats. But with that, let's turn it over to Inez to kick us off.
Thanks, Ben. So the big news this week is, of course, the fact that President Trump is going to use his 30-day emergency authority to essentially take over policing in the District of Columbia, the city itself. Now, the response has been another one of those Democrats, I really strategic errors, in my view, seizing on the 20 side of an 80-20 issue. There would be, all kinds of arguments available to them. Maybe they think this is overkill, or they think that Trump, they could have made a lot of different arguments, but they went with the argument that crime is fine in the capital city of America. And everyone who lives there, who has spent any amount of time there, knows that that is complete horse crap, to be honest, right? Everybody knows that there's a problem with crime in Washington, D.C. Just a few of the personal stories. I know Amber, who's out this week, has shared her own on Twitter. I'm sure Will has some as well. I mean, I lived in the district on and off for 10 years, and I was the victim of various, fortunately, luckily minor crimes, stealing license plates. I got stalked into my building. I witnessed bodies being picked up after murders. I had just gone into a restaurant or a bar when there were shots exchanged across my street. There were bullet holes and I want to emphasize that all of this was in the nice parts of DC. There is this dynamic in most American cities where there might be very high crime rates, but still, if you're wealthy enough or have attachment to some of these institutions, for example, like Columbia up in northern Manhattan, that like there's kind of an insulation that you can give yourself either by money or geography from this kind of crime. I want to emphasize how small the District of Columbia is and how that's really not the case in DC. There have been, in the last several years, multiple murders in broad daylight in Georgetown, which is considered the nicest part of DC, right on 33rd and M, right there in Washington, D.C. Union Station has been a crime-ridden hellhole for a long time, especially since the pandemic. I mean, there are no seats in that station anymore because they will be taken over by homeless, drug users, and criminals. It is a really bad situation. And so finally, President Trump seized upon this frankly heroic story from one of the Doge employees that was known as Big Balls, right? This guy was with his girlfriend late at night, and in the Capitol, was jumped by a gang of youths, which again I'll get to. There's a juvenile problem, massive crime, a juvenile crime problem in Washington, D.C. There are literally like packs of teenagers, mostly black, but not exclusively, just roaming around the city late at night, looking to either carjack people or mug them or do all kinds of violent things to them. So it looks like he shoved the girl in the car and locked the car and then was beaten by this gang of youths. Now people are making fun of it. Oh, youths, like, he was beaten up by teenagers. I would like you to see these packs of teenagers, to be honest with you. I've seen them walking around. A lot of them have the ankle monitors for already going through the criminal justice system. in any case, this horrible beating that was delivered, I mean, and the guy looks really bad in pictures. It doesn't look like they just had a fight with him. It looks like they kicked the crap out of him. He's lucky to be alive, frankly. So they used that incident to go ahead and use this emergency power. He has it for 30 days. And then, of course, Congress has plenary power over the district. There is something called the Home Rule Act that created the city council, the mayorship of DC. All of that is at the behest of Congress, and Congress can change that at any time. It is governed by the federal government ultimately, and they voluntarily cede certain duties to the municipal level government in Washington, D.C. That's totally voluntary and can be reversed at any time. So, I mean, frankly, this is long, long overdue. Everybody, again, who knows this, it's very funny to see Democrats go down this road of just denying the crime problem in Washington, D.C., because everybody, because of the small size of it, everybody knows somebody. I know people who have been carjacked, like personally. I know people who have been mugged personally in DC. And everybody who has lived in the district for a period of time knows somebody who's been the victim of a serious or violent crime, as opposed to just the things that I listed that happened to me, like, exposure, inappropriate exposure in parks or on the metro. Like, that's another one that happened to me and has happened to almost everybody in DC. So they're really going with this. Crime is fine in DC. I wonder what you guys think. I'll just add one more, or I guess two little facts to add to this. One, the big narrative that Democrats are hanging their hat on is that, again, that crime doesn't exist because there's a small drop between 2024 and 2025 and 2023 and 2024 crime statistics. Part of that might be true, that like it peaked and is coming down. That's been the pattern in a few cities, frankly. But it's still really high, and it's really high in comparison to, say, 2016, 2015. All the incidents that I was listing, they all happened in like 2015, 2016, 2018, right? So even compared to those already bad numbers, 2025 is on track to be higher than all of those years. So it's just actually blatantly false. The thing you're seeing floating around about it's the lowest in 30 years, that's not true. It's merely slightly lower than the last two catastrophic years. And then the other thing is that a part of that decrease is also suspect, because the police union in DC has said that those stats are being cooked. And there is a police district commissioner who's actually on administrative leave for cooking these books, allegedly. And they would do things like code for felony assault, which is not something that is reported in the daily crime statistics or reported by the FBI. So they would take other crimes and then code them as less serious crimes and then say, oh, violent crime has gone down. Well, it's also that they're just not recording violent crime to the same extent that they were 2 years ago. So we're not even sure if that small improvement is real or if it's, due to cooking the stats. But in any case, what do you guys think about Democrats going full bore on the notion that crime is just fine in our nation's capital?
Yeah, clearly not. I just like you. I have a very close friend who was in law school who was violently mugged. There's been carjackings of Congress people, and just recently, I lived in DC for quite a long time. I went to law school there between 2012 and 2015, and then I lived there again from, I'd say, about 2017 to 2020. So a solid 6-7 years of living in DC proper. And I just came back recently to go to the Cherry Blossom Festival, and my family and I we stayed in a hotel in Pentagon City. And when I got off the metro at Law and Fun Plaza, literally the first thing I see on a Sunday, bright, beautiful day, tons of tourists out, for the Cherry Blossom Festival, biggest festival of the year, is a gang of ATV riders in the middle of DC driving down, some doing wheelies. And a lot of people made fun of this on television, like, oh, you're afraid of wheelies. It's like, no, I'm concerned for my child about the kind of people who would drive an ATV down the middle of the street in the middle of a major festival. They clearly have trouble conforming their behavior to the law and feel a level of impunity because they're not even trying to hide it. They're just, they don't care. They're out there, driving extremely loud vehicles that are totally unregistered and illegal, and nobody's stopping them, and nobody does. And these gangs have murder people, carjack people, you name it. But it's an indication that the DC police just they don't have a handle on law and order in the city. Everybody knows it. And the idea that this would be, it's funny, there's like this weird set of fears. Like liberals are terrified they're saying, oh, it's incipient fascism that the president, the leader of the federal government, is exerting policing authority over the one federal district in this country. And yet they want to, do this weird thing where they're pretending, oh, what, you care about crime? Like you're scared of being in a city? Like, no, I just have young children. Like, just because you're like some like childless dysgenic freak who like doesn't care about these things doesn't mean that normal people don't.
Well, it's been so interesting to see the same people who hate anecdotal evidence when it's stories like yours, Will, or Inez's stories, or everyone who's been a victim of crime in Washington. Then you see these guys. I can't remember who the journalist was, but I'm a journalist. I live in Arlington, and I commute to Washington every day, and nothing bad's ever happened to me. It's like, okay, so you live in Arlington, number one, and I'm sure you choose your commute to, let's say, reduce any risk, and you're willing to completely dismiss all of the actual stories of people who are victims of crime. I love the responses where they said, "Okay, perfect. So why don't you put on a GoPro and take a walk in X, Y, and Z neighborhoods and let us know how that goes for you." Just one other thing. It's been super fun seeing Bukele as a verb. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just, it's obviously there's anecdotal evidence, there's empirical evidence. The numbers are simply staggering by civil society standards, and this is our nation's capital, and that's a disgrace at the outset. But beyond that, I mean, I do think that this is just another illustration of the fact that the Democrat Party is totally rudderless. They're grasping for talking points here, beyond the fact that essentially they're just dismissing the reality on the ground of the lack of safety for the denizens of DC. And by the way, of course, this shows utter contempt and neglect for blue voters, their own constituents in DC. But setting that aside, the other talking points were Trump's an authoritarian here, which I think obviously doesn't wash with anyone. If the authorities on the ground aren't willing to do their job to keep people safe, then some entity has to step in and basically take the city into conservatorship, essentially, or the district into conservatorship, rather. But even setting that aside, then the other talking point was January 6th. January 6th is where there was the real threat to security within Washington, D.C. And they are just grasping at straws. And I've never seen Democrats as rudderless and lost in the wilderness as they seem to be here, with the exception that I don't think it is totally that they're rudderless. I think it is that they're completely in hock to their progressive base, and their progressive base demands refusing to acknowledge the fact that their anti-policing policies lead to rampant crime, antisocial behavior, and all of these maladies. The progressive base demands it. They can't call for far more robust, vigorous policing because it's totally anathema to their base, their elite, upper middle class progressive base that doesn't have to deal with the consequences of the policies, like those purported journalists who claim that there's no problem, there's nothing to see here in Washington, D.C. So they have a real political problem in the short term, which is that they're going to keep taking 80-20 or 90-10 issues. They're going to continue defending the indefensible, whether it's the worst of the worst among the criminal illegal aliens and gangbangers, whether it's the Hamasniks, whether it's policies that lead to people getting mugged and assaulted and murdered. More and more people probably are going to continue to be mugged by reality. And you add that to the fact that the progressive base does not reflect the majority of the country, anything close to it, they're going to have electoral problems. But the blue jurisdictions are going to continue to get more polarized and more radical and more insane. And the question ultimately for the Dems is going to be, is the thought process long term that the older, more normie Dems are going to die off essentially and be replaced by the radicals? Or do they want to create enough of a crisis with the areas that they control that it enables them to seize power down the road? But it's not clear what the logic is essentially of continuing to take losing issues with the vast majority of Americans, at least in the near term. Maybe it's a long-term play, but near term, I think it's going to lead to continued pain on the electoral side for Dems nationally. And we'll see, I guess, in the midterms. And speaking of kind of the political map and maybe the balance of power in the House and beyond, we've talked in prior episodes, obviously, about redistricting, gerrymandering, etc. And there is sort of a tangent related to this, which is the broader question about the census and how we apportion seats. And then also, of course, there are threads that relate to then redistricting as well. So I've talked a lot before about the notion of excluding non-citizens from the census. There was a battle over this during the Trump 1 administration. First, the Trump 1 administration sought to reinstate a question on the census, simply asking, are you a citizen? The Supreme Court said you can ask that question, but the route that the first Trump administration took to do it was quote unquote pretextual. And so they said under the Administrative Procedures Act, you can't ask that question this time. And then later on, the Trump administration put out a memorandum calling for using all available authorities, essentially, to be able to do a count, execute a count of non-citizens, and then potentially use that number, only the citizen number, for apportioning House seats in the decennial census, the 2020 census. Well, in light of this battle over redistricting, President Trump came out with a Truth Social post last week where he said this, quote, I've instructed our Department of Commerce to immediately begin work on a new and highly accurate census based on modern day facts and figures, and importantly, using the results and information gained from the presidential election of 2024. People who are in our country illegally will not be counted in the census. Thank you for your attention to this matter, of course, is the ending to that. And this raises a lot of interesting questions, and there are factual matters here, and then there are going to be debated legal matters. It's not clear if the president is calling for a mid-decade census and then a mid-decade census for purposes of reapportioning House seats. As we noted in a prior episode, there were quote-unquote census errors in 2020, where, of course, it was a Biden administration, essentially, that did not do a count of non-citizens and exclude them. But there were also errors, so-called, that led to overrepresentation, meaning more House seats being allocated to generally blue states and fewer being allocated to red states than there should have been. There's also obviously been massive in-migration, particularly to red states like the Floridas and the Texases of the world, that are likely not reflected in the way that House seats are apportioned today, COVID-related and otherwise. So first, mid-decade census. Under federal law, you can call for a census mid-decade in a year ending in 5. I don't believe that it's been done under federal law before, but it can be done. However, it cannot be used for purposes of apportionment under current law. However, if you did conduct a census, and you did conduct a census where you could parse out citizens from non-citizens, it is possible that states could redistrict based upon citizen population rather than total population. There's been some Supreme Court rulings on this, and the Supreme Court hasn't staked out a position one way or the other, but it does appear that potentially states could use eligible voter population to draw their districts, which could have an impact as well on ultimately representation in Congress. And then there are the broader questions about, can you apportion seats only based off citizens? This comes down to the 14th Amendment, counting the whole number of persons, excluding Indians non-taxed. Do you have to get a constitutional amendment to change that? Is it wrong to consider non-citizens as whole persons because the Constitution itself is a pact among we the people, i.e. the citizens who establish the country? And then there's also other questions around who makes the call. Could the president unilaterally do it? Does Congress have to do it, et cetera? So all these different questions essentially about excluding non-citizens, potentially what you'd have to do to exclude them. Does this mean a call for just a new census that basically would have to be executed this year under current law? Will Congress step in and actually make changes? All major questions, live questions, I think, questions that ought to be debated. My view has always been non-citizens should be excluded. There are all sorts of reductio ad absurdum examples you could raise, like, for example, And this comes from John Eastman, who has testified on behalf of Republicans for excluding non-citizens before. He said, well, if there's Olympic Games held in a given year and you have millions of people descending on an individual city for a fixed period of time that happens to be when you're doing the census count, should those people be counted because they are inhabiting that place in the period of time the census is conducted? And I think the answer is obviously no. So, and obviously when the 14th Amendment was crafted, we didn't have an influx of millions and millions of non-citizens, illegal aliens, via an invasion policy. So all of these questions are live. I think fascinating. It's very good that the administration is aggressively seeking to intervene here on this matter. So I turn it over to the group. What do you make of the Truth Social post, and where do you think this goes?
I'm very happy, obviously, that they're, being aggressive about the census. It was there's a lot of evidence that it undercounted places like Florida. You really can't take seriously a lot of the protests against that. It's the Democrat states that are losing population, Republican states that are gaining it, and games of the census are essentially trying to stave off that reality that's going to make it a lot harder for Democrats to either win a majority in the House or win the presidency going forward. I was seeing numbers that say, we're going to gain enough seats, at least in a properly counted census by, if not now, by 2030, that, if you're going to change the swing state calculus, that even if Democrats win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that's not going to be enough. They're going to need to win another swing state that historically they've had real trouble winning. So I think, we should be trying to push forward with the census. And the big takeaway of Democrats are constantly trying to, issue these threats like, oh, if you do this, then, whoa, that really will breach whatever norm that, we've pretended to respect for so long. Like, no, you guys haven't been respecting norms forever. Just look at the Illinois map. If you took seriously norms, that Illinois map would look very different. It wouldn't look like the most gerrymandered, ridiculous thing in the country. The Democrats have already almost maximized their gerrymandering output, and they simply can't compete with Republicans who have generally been holding back. So, no, the Democrats don't have a credible threat here. That's why they're being so frantic.
Yeah, one thing that's I think lost in some of this debate, which we've covered week after week here, is that some of those Texas districts that the government there are trying to redraw are actually required to be redrawn because of a 2024 Supreme Court case, Pettaway v. Galveston, and where the Supreme Court said, well, yes, you can under the Voting Rights Act, and we can. They left aside the question of whether you can purposely, basically racially gerrymander, which is almost required by the Voting Rights Act in a certain way. So they left that question aside. But what they did say is drawing these coalition districts. So in Texas, they drew these minority, I'm putting quotes on the minority majority districts by combining Black and Hispanic voters in the same district to create a majority. And the court in 2024 said, no, that's not what the Voting Rights Act said, leaving aside the question undecided as to whether, it's constitutional to draw racial districts to begin with, this kind of racial balancing in drawing districts. For sure, what you can't do is add up different minority groups that vote for the same party and create districts based on that. And that's what Texas had actually done there. So some of these districts that are being redrawn are required to be redrawn by this 2024 Supreme Court case. And Harmeet Dillon over at the DOJ sent Texas a letter to this effect when the Trump administration took office. So part of what they're doing there is actually just undoing something that is unconstitutional and illegal that has been happening, that Democrats have been doing for a long time. Now, there is this larger question of, should this be constitutional at all, to essentially gather voters of a particular race in a district just to grant the Democratic Party a special district. So that's a whole bigger can of fish. But for sure, this kind of coalition building where there's just plucking different racial groups that essentially vote for the Democratic Party and putting them together in a Democratic district, the court said no on that in 2024. And that's that's part of what's spurring this. Obviously, there are political considerations, and we've talked about those. Obviously, Democrats, when they have the opportunity, they draw their districts in Democratic states that we've mentioned, Illinois, California, New York. They draw them very, very favorably to the Democratic Party, and they leave Republicans without representation in blue states. And so there's obviously a political gamesmanship going on here, but I just wanted to point out there is an underlying legal problem as well. you can draw your districts partisanly, and the court has mostly stayed out of that as a political question. But it's very different if you're drawing it on racial lines, and in particular, this combining of different racial groups that just happen to vote for the same political party is just a step too far for the court.
Well, I'll say one little thing, which is there's been so much talk about all of this, and I was just recently in New England, and thinking to myself, well, New England seems to be the most gerrymandered region of the United States, and lo and behold, I've seen a bunch of articles talking about this very thing, that there are 6 states, 21 House seats spread over 6 states without a single GOP representative, and there are millions of Republicans all across New England. So it's not just a state, it's an entire region that's been gerrymandered in favor of the Democrats in New England.
And with that, let's turn over to Will to talk about some of the conflict resolution going on throughout the globe under the Trump administration.
Yeah, so I mean, Trump has already made a number of peace agreements and essentially stopped wars in their infancy. I mean, he managed to stop a conflict between India and Pakistan from happening, which could have gone nuclear. But I think one of the biggest achievements diplomatically that he's had was late last week when he got Armenia and Azerbaijan to get together and sign a peace agreement. And if you're at all familiar with the history of Armenia and Azerbaijan, 2 countries in the Caucasus to the northwest of Iran, south of Russia, you'll know that that's a crazy impressive accomplishment. I mean, Armenia and Azerbaijan, you have an Islamic country and an Orthodox Christian country that have been fighting with each other for 30 some years. The borders are a complete mess because the populations aren't neatly divided between the 2 territories. You have, Armenia kind of having this territory splitting Azerbaijan in half with an exclave. And then internally in Azerbaijan, there's another portion of the country that was almost all Armenian, that was source of enormous conflicts for years, called Nagorno-Karabakh. That was mainly Armenian until the Azerbaijanis effectively won and told the Armenians to get out and cross the border into Armenia. So, there's been huge chaos between these countries. These countries have hated each other, deep blood feud type stuff. And President Trump just got them to agree to a full peace agreement and maybe end the war. And both of them were there smiling and talking about how Trump needed to get the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a remarkable achievement. The United Nations hasn't achieved that in decades, and yet Trump somehow was able to see what needed to happen here. And I think it looks something like, basically the Azeris needed to have some sort of transport connectivity between their main territory and their exclave to the west of Armenia. And I'm not sure exactly what the Armenians needed, but whatever it was, you have a peace deal. And that's a remarkable achievement, and Trump deserves a lot of credit for it. Moreover, this is not where Trump's stopping. He's meeting with Putin this Friday in Anchorage. And people like John Bolton are already saying it's a loss to even meet with Putin, which is just absurd. It would be much better for the world if the war between Ukraine and Russia came to an end. And, Trump isn't some pacifist either. One of the things that people need to understand, Trump's indicated a willingness to say to the Ukrainians that they need to cede some territory, just as a reflection of the facts on the ground, that they don't have that territory and it doesn't, they're not going to get it back because the United States isn't willing to go into a full-scale war. But Russia was also making absurd demands up until recently, where they were saying, we demand a massive amount of Ukrainian territory, including territory they hadn't even managed to conquer militarily yet. And the United States was like, no, that's stupid. You're not going to get that, and we're not going to give it to you. So if we're finally at a place where everybody's sort of making more reasonable demands that reflect the state of affairs on the ground, and Trump manages to finally secure a peace agreement, well, it would be a massive win for the entire world and massively reduce the risk of any sort of nuclear conflict. So I don't know what you guys think of Trump's latest diplomatic accomplishments. I'm just really impressed by it. He would be a shoo-in for the Nobel Peace Prize in any reasonable world for the resolution of the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict alone. That would be sufficient for the Nobel Peace Prize in any normal year. But, the Nobel Committee hates Trump, so they're probably not going to give it to him and make themselves look even more ridiculous than they already do.
Well, it's not just the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. It's literally everyone who would be very, very happy if any other leader did these things. I mean, it's like this global Trump derangement syndrome, and they can't even see. They're just blinded by it. So all over Europe, they've been talking about Armenia and Azerbaijan for, of course, decades, years. and there's no solution, there's no solution. And then when there's an obvious win here, win for peace, people simply can't acknowledge that something good has happened. So, one does wonder what kind of peace Trump could achieve that would make people say, "Oh, okay, that one was good." I mean, I think it's impossible to think of something. I don't know what the rest of you think.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that all of these different parties, India and Pakistan, Azerbaijan and Armenia, afterwards come out and say that Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, obviously it matters to him because he's telling them to say that, I'm pretty sure. That being said, there is an objective case for Trump to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and regardless of whether the sort of politicized committee gives it to him, he has done a remarkable job. If you think about adding up the Abraham Accords from his first term that are being strengthened probably as we speak in this term. When you add up this latest thing with Azerbaijan and Armenia, India and Pakistan, I mean, there are a lot of accords. Now you're getting to a lot of resolutions of long-term conflicts in the world that could get very dangerous. Of course, there is this big one, Ukraine and Russia. I the Trump both term one, but really is when I changed my mind about this. But term two continues this, which is there is this personal element to negotiation. I think for a long time, and I count myself among people like this. People have a tendency to think of foreign policy as ideological, the way that, and I think we think about domestic policy. And the truth is that there is so much that's dependent on the individual personality of the people who are in the room. And I think that President Trump is undoubtedly a really good negotiator, right? That doesn't mean he's always going to come away with a positive for the United States every time he sits down, but it does make those kinds of statements, like by John Bolton, to me, nonsensical, because Trump has proven over and over again that he can get results that have eluded the foreign policy establishment for many, many decades. That doesn't mean that everything he does turns to gold, although it sometimes seems that way, right? That he has this personal touch that is able to cut through some of this stuff and actually just hammer out a deal the same way that he hammered out real estate deals in New York City, right? And I don't know, it's been a very interesting thing to watch, and I think it's something that any serious historians writing about this period will have to write about in detail. This very man of history making a return, right? That actually Trump being in the room physically with somebody, with some of these leaders, has made a tremendous difference. So, and I would just close with saying one point that I don't think gets brought up enough in context of the Ukraine-Russia war is that Russia has taken its neighbors' territory, whether Ukraine or Georgia, South Ossetia in Georgia. But under every administration, for the last several administrations, under George W. Bush, under Obama, right, under Joe Biden, famously, right, this big war now, the only administration that Russia has not taken territory of its neighbors under in recent history is Trump 1, and we'll see about making this, a resolution to this war in Trump 2. But and it's definitely a tall order. But I just think that's a fact that doesn't get pointed out enough in all of this context. So I think Trump is actually on pretty solid those speculative grounds when he says this war never would have started if I were in office, because his tenure was the one exception where Russia did not take any of its neighbors' territories when Trump was in office and Trump won.
I agree. I've long held that Trump is a singular force for peace because of his, well, first of all, unconventional approach to challenges around the world, which includes a focus on interests over ideals, not to the exclusion of ideals, but national interest as being the thing that predominates. Obviously, principal to principal relations do matter, and they can have disproportionate sway, even if some may discount it. But it's also that he threatens the use of all of the capabilities and levers and strengths that America has, and that he could bring that down on your head to the extent you cross us. And that credible threat to me is what deterred the world's strongmen evildoers who would seek to do us harm during Trump 1. That force of nature, but also the real substantive assets that can be brought to bear, I think is very significant and plays a role in these cessations of hostilities that the second Trump administration has been able to negotiate it. And so I think basically he makes America not a superpower in name only, but we are a superpower with Trump at the commands, and that causes people in the room who are on different sides to get on board ultimately in ways that they wouldn't do. They would call the bluffs of other leaders historically, and that's why I think you had more conflicts under other presidents than Donald Trump in large part. So it's a demonstration that the U.S. is still a superpower. This notion that we're isolationist or retrenching from the world. No, we're actually asserting ourselves in the world. And that assertion of ourselves is leading to peace, not conflict. And that's a major takeaway, I think, from both Trump 1 and Trump 2. Doesn't mean we engage in needless forever wars, aimless forever wars, non-core conflicts, but it does mean that we seek to bring those conflicts to an end through aggressively intervening, and it may be diplomatic, and it may be negotiations, or sometimes it may involve the use of hard power as well. But I think we've seen one of the most successful national security and foreign policies of any president in U.S. history under Donald Trump. He definitely deserves credit for it. And of course, he'll never get credit for it from our establishment because it's a total repudiation of establishment national security and foreign policy. On that note, let's turn it over to Ellen to talk a little bit about some more machinations from the EU censorship industrial complex, something, by the way, that the Trump administration has sought to challenge.
Yeah, thank you very much. It seems like every time I'm here, it's to report some crazy new EU policy that proves J.D. Vance's speech 100% correct when he spoke at the Munich Security Conference. So this is a topic, a proposal that's kind of flying under the radar. It's the newest push for so-called chat control. So the European Union, this is Brussels, tried a few years ago to put some restrictions on the encryptions in chat messaging. Now, again, this has reared its ugly head. So the idea is the proposal would force tech companies like behind WhatsApp, Signal, iMessage, basically all currently encrypted messaging platforms to scan all private messages and images being sent for quote unquote illegal content. And of course, the illegal content that they claim to want to protect users from and to prosecute is child sexual abuse material, which of course is a noble goal. Nobody wants to stop the protection of children from horrific abuse, I guess. But here's the problem. To make it work, you have to break end-to-end encryption. And that's, of course, the technology that keeps our texts and calls private from hackers, corporations, governments. And once that's gone, of course, every message you send could be scanned in real time, turning your phone into a surveillance device if you are in Europe. Shockingly, there are a number of countries who are supporting this, who didn't support the earlier iteration. I think they probably see benefits beyond the protection of vulnerable children in these policies. But of course, this is really not about tech. It's about values. It's about freedom. And going back to J.D. Vance, he's been so vocal about this, both at the Munich Security Conference and recently last week when he was in the UK, he was saying, the UK risks going down a very dark path of losing free speech altogether. And the West, including the UK and the US under Biden, of course, got very comfortable with censoring ideas they didn't like. So Obviously, this is a betrayal of Western values, echoing Soviet-style control. And so so other European countries, in addition to being on board with this chat control, which, by the way, would also mean that anyone using these messaging platforms to communicate with anyone based in Europe, so for example, me, would be subject to these to the breaking of this end-to-end encryption once, I don't know, once the message arrives at my house. I don't know exactly where in the message stream it would come. But you have France and Sweden debating rules that would force the decryption of internet traffic logs of VPNs. So people who are trying to keep their search histories private, France and Sweden want to think about breaking that. Spain is leading a block of 15 EU member states to ban end-to-end encryption altogether. And the UK has been forcing services like iCloud to disable certain protections. So all of this, of course, is and then of course here in Austria, they passed a law allowing the government allows Trojan horse software to be used to intercept encrypted chat once somebody is a suspect. Suspected of what? I don't know. I don't know if it requires probable cause, reasonable suspicion, or what. But that's a scary thing. So the discourse is always, every time there's a European discussion about chat and privacy and technological, let's say tech privacy generally, it's always, oh, the children. As we've seen, of course, especially in the UK, it's coming to light that the government doesn't actually care about actual children being abused in the UK. But apparently, all of these countries are very concerned about vulnerable children being further victimized through encrypted chats. So my sense is, just like all of these other debates, particularly the gun and Second Amendment debate or discussion or rhetoric in the US, criminals figure out a way to do things. There's gun crime, rampant gun crime in Brussels, despite very strict gun control laws. So the point is, criminals know how to circumvent things, and they're awfully clever. So I'm not sure that if this passes, that you're going to protect more kids. I think what you're going to do is have basically a dragnet for private messaging that the government doesn't like. So what do you all think? Is Europe crazy as usual? Yes, but what else?
Yeah, speaking of Soviet echoes, Ellen, there was of course that van that was going around supposedly to prove a point to JD Vance after he made that speech in the UK with the funny big fat face JD Vance memes, which first of all he clearly finds funny, but second of all it really reminded me of that old Soviet joke, famous Soviet joke, which is, yes, we have free speech here. The American says, oh, I have free speech in America. I can go to the middle of Times Square and I can shout F Kennedy, right? And the Soviet says, yeah, we have free speech too. I also can go to the middle of Red Square and shout F Kennedy. Right. So that's exactly the vibe that I got from that van. Yeah. Oh, congratulations. You have free speech to do the popular thing that your government would like you to say. Right. That's not the definition. But yeah, Ellen has a great point, made a great point about how this sweeps in Americans. There are chats like ours for this show, right, that include people who are both in Europe and the United States. So there's potentially an issue of protecting American citizens' free speech rights with this new push for the censorship regime. And then, of course, this is going to be a continual sticking point between the United States and European countries and the UK. And I think the vice president has made that clear repeatedly over and over again. There are really these two big problems that this administration had with our European friends. And the first one is sort of being on its way, at least, to being rectified, right? Which is that that our allies in NATO were not pulling their weight, not spending enough money, not being worthy allies to even defend themselves from potential Russian threats, right? And the U.S. was doing all the heavy lifting expensively in that relationship. That seems to be on its way to at least being partially rectified, thanks in part to Trump being willing to say things that the foreign policy establishment was not willing to say for many decades, even though they all agreed that this had to happen, right? But the second piece of it is in some way more, it's deeper, right? It is what J.D. Vance pointed to in his speech, saying, why are we friends, right? Is it merely an accident of this particular sort of geographic alignment? Is a realpolitik relationship between Europe and the United States? If so, if those geopolitical realities change, then we can expect that alliance to fall out, right? If it's based on something deeper than that, a certain kind of common values or common understanding between the new world and the old on issues like free speech and liberty, then that fundamental underlying basis for that alliance is being fractured right now. It's really being strained by these kinds of moves that move Europe closer to censorship and closer to countries that don't have anything that Americans would recognize as free speech.
The Europeans are crazy. The whole attempt to mock JD Vance for not saying the Europeans are crazy is ridiculous. And it's coming to a head. I think, the Europeans have tried pretty hard to, especially the UK, is with their recent laws about imposing their speech rights and speech laws on American companies. That is not going to fly. And I think, the EU trade deal should be a hint of what the actual power dynamics here are. We get our way and you don't, because you're more dependent on us than the countries who take our financial military aid. You need our troops to be present in your countries to guard you against Russia, which would roll over you in a second if it weren't for us. So I think I think Trump really does understand where the negotiating leverage lies here, given how much Europe has underinvested in its own defense and overinvested in, destroying its nuclear plants. So, our tolerance for European nonsense on this is pretty low.
I think that this segment is a poignant reminder that the censorship industrial complex is still extant. It's just sort of right now in exile, maybe in the US, or quiet, because to some extent it's been discredited and because it doesn't have political representation at the highest levels of the US government, but it still exists throughout the rest of the world. The administration, as I noted, has been very aggressive, not only rhetorically, but also in sanctioning, for example, Brazil's Supreme Court Justice, who's de Moraes, who is sort of the lead censor in the world, who has gone after U.S. figures, U.S. companies, etc. But these censorship regimes overseas, of course, have collateral damage, will have collateral damage for U.S. speakers. There are, of course, the threats, as Will noted, via the different censorship content moderation regimes being imposed that threaten billions and billions of dollars in crippling fines to American companies. While those fines may not come to pass with the Trump administration in power, or the Trump administration may go about sanctioning qua sanctions or de facto sanctioning our trade partners to the extent they threaten American companies in the tech space on these grounds, is yet to be seen. I think we should be pretty confident that the administration won't tolerate it and that it will tether other issues to the matter of free speech. But the question is going to be, with potentially only 4 years to protect America from the foreign sources of censorship, and with the domestic censors, of course, their worldview still persists and prevails across most of our leading institutions. What happens after? And that's the big question. Is there a way that you can fundamentally deconstruct the censorship industrial complex, or is the threat going to loom and we're going to have a 4+ year interregnum, but then it's going to return and be far more comprehensive, far more insidious, and have learned the lessons of what's happened in recent years, including what we've seen disclosed via court discovery and otherwise, and learn ways to get around it going forward? That's an open question, I think, for the future, and hopefully the administration's thinking very deeply about that and going to act accordingly. With that, let's go to parting shots with whoever wants to kick it off.
I'm going to get started because I have a hard out. There was a court ruling that came down last week that kind of went a little under the radar because there were a lot of other things going on. But the DC Circuit slapped down James Boasberg's attempt to impose criminal contempt on administration officials for failing to comply, in his view, with the ruling that the Supreme Court had already found was unlawful, that he had no jurisdiction to enter. Two judges really slapped him down hard. One of them said because that his order was so ambiguous, it was not, an interpretation that was charitable to the government would say that the government complied, because he said don't remove these big individuals from the United States, and they were already outside of the United States when they were removed outside of the territory. And then Judge Rao had a blistering opinion that ripped into him for attempting to coerce compliance with an unlawful order to avoid the criminal contempt. Right. That was a remarkable thing that this judge did, effectively trying to use criminal contempt proceedings to usurp the executive branch's foreign affairs authority, because he said, well, if you assert custody over these removed aliens, then I won't issue criminal contempt. Never mind that the Supreme Court had said, this is the thing you can't do. You don't get to assert jurisdiction over this dispute. Really slapped down for that hard. Like they didn't just dismiss him or reverse him. They granted a writ of mandamus against Judge Boasberg to prevent him from continuing with this criminal contempt proceedings. So big W to the administration. I really think that the tolerance for a lower court shenanigans is coming to an end here, and I'm optimistic that things will improve in the next 6 months or so.
So Will took half of what my parting shots were going to be. I was going to have one good on the courts for doing this and then one bad. So I'll talk about the bad that came out of lower courts, and we'll see ultimately if they get smacked down. But in the CASA case, you'll remember that the CASA case represented 3 consolidated cases before the Supreme Court. In the birthright citizenship case, that was really about universal injunctions, where the Supreme Court curtailed universal injunctions. But all 3 cases that were consolidated in CASA persist. So the CASA case itself, the Judge Boardman, who I believe is a Maryland district judge, who has been against the Trump administration in a number of cases, she certified a class in that case, which of course is seeking injunctive relief, that consists of, quote, any child who has been born or will be born in the United States after February 19th, 2025. So this is it's a class that's going to lead to a universal injunction, essentially, which is going to challenge, again, first of all, it reflects that the concerns of the likes of Justices Alito, Thomas, and others were merited, that the workarounds in the CASA case might well be exploited by lower courts. And it was anticipated, of course, that the plaintiffs in these cases would seek class certification so that they could get broad relief, including universal relief, to try and circumvent that ruling. There's obviously irony here about, as someone raised, if children have citizenship rights, do they have a right to life? And this is going to lead to all sorts of challenges, I think, going the other way, to the extent judges are going to take this posture with respect to class actions, with respect to birthright citizens, so-called. But I think this is a reminder that we're going to have all manner of debates between the executive branch and the judiciary, and then over all these different remedies that are going to be used to circumvent the CASA ruling. It's going to come to a head, and the Supreme Court is going to be thrust right back into the position of saying, what are the limitations on all of these different remedies? Or are there no limitations, in which case, from a practical perspective, the CASA ruling ends up proving moot or irrelevant at the end of the day, again, rendering the concerns of Justice Alito et al. Very prescient.
Yeah, my final thought is just to add a few things to the DC crime segment that I didn't have time to add. I want to put the homicide rate in DC in context, because there's because I think media is here, and because people from, especially from outside of the United States, think of the flagship city of the United States, not as Washington, D.C., but as New York City. And so there's a ton of coverage, rightfully so, about the crime in New York City. The homicide rate in Washington, D.C. on a per capita basis, like, accounting for the fact that New York City is much, much bigger, is 10 times the murder rate in New York City. Okay, that actually apparently makes it 8 times the murder rate in Fallujah. So that just, I wanted to like contextualize some of these numbers. It's not just anecdotes. The reason that I went with anecdotes is because it just highlights how much these people are actually lying. They cannot stand to admit that something that Trump said was true, to the extent it's not actually the usual case where you have like people like this Arlington journalist who just like don't ever interact with any part of the city, where they just price themselves out of interacting with the unpleasant parts of the city or the dangerous parts of the city. That's the dynamic usually in most of these crime discussions. That's very common dynamic. So I'm not saying it's not true, but in DC, there's an additional layer of just plain lying, because they cannot stand to say that Trump is right about crime in DC, because they can't stand that he's right about anything, right? Because it's so small and the crime is so outrageous. And that is the last couple years, okay, that have just come down a little bit off a peak that was already completely outrageous. So, this is the most basic expectation of government. And when the government doesn't fulfill this, bad things happen, both because crime becomes rampant and law and order completely descends into chaos, and also because people either leave or they become super radicalized, right? If you want people to believe in the Bukele way, then continue to allow this kind of rampant criminality that affects basically everyone on a personal basis, either themselves or their friends or their family have experienced violent crime in DC. People will radicalize really quickly on those issues. It's the reason that Daniel Penny got off in New York City, and we see how blue New York is now that they're considering Mondami and reversing a lot of this stuff. So I just wanted to put some of that more context on those numbers. DC really is an extraordinarily violent city, even by American standards, even by American urban standards. It is an extraordinarily violent city, and there's been a lot of people have died. A lot of people have had their lives destroyed by that violence. And to the extent that Trump can do anything about it in the next 30 days, by doing what the DC government refuses to do, I think that will be not only good for his supporters and good for the people who come in to see the nation's capital and don't have to duck flying bullets. But also, you know what? I think there will be a lot of these people who are lying about it right now who will be quietly relieved that the carjacking rate has gone down, and that they don't feel like they have to run red lights the way that Joe Biden was talking about back in the 80s and the 90s, just to avoid being carjacked on intersections in Washington, D.C. So I think they'll be quietly appreciative of Trump's efforts, even as they scream about them publicly.
That's so true. I'd love to talk more about that, but I actually have a final thought going back to the UK and digging in to this J.D. Vance's pointing out repeatedly that the UK is going down this really fast, steep hill against freedom of speech. So the US Department of State, I think it's every year, maybe every 2 years, they put out country reports, and they just put out a country report on the UK and expressed concern that human rights in the UK in 2024, so it's looking back at the year before, had worsened, and there were credible reports of serious restrictions on freedom of expression. And then we think back to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, where he talks about people being arrested for silent prayer. Keir Starmer, in response to this report just the other day, a couple days ago, let's say 3 days ago, He said, "Free speech is vital for democracy around the world, including here in the UK, and we're proud to uphold freedoms whilst keeping our citizens safe." Well, guess what? Isabel von Spruce, who had been arrested for silently praying in her head on a public street near an abortion facility in Birmingham, and had been arrested twice before, exonerated. The police had to pay damages to her. She's been now arrested a third time as of 2 days ago. So that these coincide. Arrested for being in a public space, praying to herself, not saying anything, not saying anything to any of the women who might be using the abortion facility. It's within a so-called buffer zone, which bans expressions of approval or disapproval of abortion within a certain space. This woman literally stands there with her eyes closed, looking down, praying silently in her head. Thoughts. She's praying thoughts in her head silently, and she's been now arrested for the third time. So maybe spare a prayer for the UK, for British people who are just trying to save the actual children from being murdered by abortion. So that's my final thought.
And before we go, a reminder to join us at NatCon 5 in Washington, D.C. It's from September 2nd to the 4th. You can register at nationalconservatism.org. And with that, on behalf of Will, Ellen, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.